Good morning, everyone, and welcome to day 2 of Deaccessioning after 2020. A special good morning to all of our colleagues, friends, students across the country getting up extremely early to start our proceedings today. I hope everyone's had a second cup of coffee by now. I hope everyone is ready for another full day of challenging and thought-provoking examination around what is an extremely polarizing issue. From the onset of organizing this event, our goal has always been to create a platform that would give adequate discussion and debate, one that would break down and dissect all the various and differing components and situations that construct and inform a museum's decisions and actions. I want to take one brief moment to thank all of our presenters for joining us in this discussion. I also want to thank the hundreds of participants in our audience for your questions and comments, and implore you to continue to send them in. While we are unfortunately only able to address an admittedly very small percentage of these questions, what I've seen thus far is an incredibly informed, passionate commentary from all sides of these issues, and they have made the conversation that much more engaged and complete. I'm very optimistic that this will continue in today's sessions. In closing our event yesterday, my colleague highlighted the need for empathy and how we address and dictate how we as a field might be moving forward. After continuing the discussion with colleagues and friends, a singular theme emerged that is abundantly clear, that while we've entitled this event Deaccessioning after 2020, the focus on issues that surround and provoke these decisions and the impact they have or intend are only, as Kaywin Feldman articulately identified, the tip of the iceberg. The issue is so much deeper and goes so much farther than any singular moment of deaccession, and illustrates that the constructive conversation must and will continue beyond this forum and beyond this moment. So what have we already seen? We've had conversations about the evolving outline and need for more data on the costs associated with our museum collections. We've heard insight from the principal legal authorities involved in litigation and in the important museum cases, and call for greater transparency within the process. We've had focused discussion with pointed histories and contemporary theory on the permanence of our objects. We've heard an impassioned insight from the leading artists about the issue of diversification within museum collections. And we've been on the inside of the wrenching and divisive decisions that some of our museums are currently facing. Finally, we've heard a charge to the future of museum leadership and our community, all beginning with Feldman's poignant address framing the ongoing issues that lie ahead. So what will today bring? Momentarily, we will examine a contentious and core issue of this discussion: how we define direct care. We're going to hear how this debate affects our history museums, and it is a particular challenge to our academic institutions. We'll have insight how this issue might address the long-standing inequity with what has recently been coined as progressive deaccessioning. And we will hear from leadership from the country's foremost museums at the center of this ongoing debate. What will I learn today? What will change my mind, or what will solidify my approach? What will guide us as a field as we move forward? Let's find out. I would like to again acknowledge all of our sponsors and collaborators that have helped make this event possible. Many thanks to our colleagues in the College of Law and the College of Visual and Performing Arts here at Syracuse University. I'd like to recognize my colleagues at University Lectures and the Humanities Center at Syracuse University for their ongoing support We want to thank the Museum Trustee Association, the Mid-Atlantic Association of Museums, the Association of Midwest Museums, the Southeastern Museums Conference, the Western Museums Association, and the Museum Association of New York for their invaluable assistance and support in bringing all of us together today. I want to remind everyone that live captioning is available. All you have to do is click on the link at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and that this session will be recorded for future viewing. We will be sharing these recordings with all the registered participants after the end of the symposium. Please keep an eye out in the coming weeks for an email with links. We will also be sending out an evaluation sheet for this event. I'd like to ask that everyone please take a few minutes to fill this out and help us plan for future potential events. We ask that all of the participants in the audience please use the Q&A function for all of your questions. But again, as I said before, we will not be able to address every single question that is submitted, but we will do our very best to do so. A reminder that we will have brief breaks in between each session today. And I'd also like to point out that we will be having concurrent sessions today, which we did not have yesterday. So please make a note to look at the agenda. Each session has a dedicated link to join within the PDF that you've received. And you can always check our bulletin board on the website for up-to-date changes and announcements to the proceedings. Once again, in the interest of time, we've decided to forego full introductions. And if you want to learn more about the presenters, the moderators, or the events, please visit the website or use your program for the full bios and information. It's now my true pleasure to introduce Session 6, Direct Care, a critical concept still struggling for meaning. Our moderator this morning is Mark Gold, a partner in the law firm of Smith, Green & Gold, LLP, and who represented the Berkshire Museum and the Everson Museum of Art in their recent deaccessionings. Good morning, Mark.
Thank you, Andrew. I see we've got a couple of minutes until 8:45, which is now 1 minute until 8:45 when our session's supposed to start. So we'll just, if you don't mind, just bear with me for 1 more minute, and then we'll get started. Again, for those who just joined us, we're just waiting till 3:45. People are still joining the room, or I'm sorry, 8:45, and we'll get started in a minute. Okay, here we go. So good morning. This morning, we're going to talk about the concept and meaning of direct care of collections. I'll introduce our panel shortly. Before I start, I want to extend a special thank you to Ellie Norman, a graduate student in the Syracuse University Museum Studies program, who is working behind the scenes here to receive, vet, and curate, or the word I might use is triage, the questions from the audience. We'll try to answer as many as we can. The concept of direct care entered the museum lexicon in 1994, when in response to advocacy from museum professionals, AAM's Code of Ethics for Museums was modified to expand the acceptable uses of the proceeds of deaccessioning to include direct care as well as acquisitions. There is a thorough and insightful piece written by Lori Bressauer and Sarah Ebel on the evolution of the professional standards on the use of deaccessioning proceeds. The link is in the resources section of the program. It provides important information on the important relationship between the professional standards and the benefit afforded by the Financial Accounting Standards Board, FASB, in museums not having to report the fair market value of their collections on their financial statements. We won't go into the history here, but in 2019, thanks to the work of Lori and Sarah, FASB modified its standard, and now FASB and AAM are aligned in allowing the use of the proceeds of deaccessioning for direct care of collections. Some observers believe that the 2019 action by FASB will make it easier for AAMD to expand its standard as well. The April 2020 statement by AAMD provided a temporary moratorium on sanctions for museums that use their deaccessioning proceeds for direct care, conditioned on the museum having a board-approved and publicly accessible policy outlining what expenses it considers as direct care. And that brings us to today's topic. What is the meaning of direct care? There was no guidance on what the term meant until 2016, when AAM issued its white paper entitled Direct Care of Collections, Ethics, Guidelines, and Recommendations. A link to the white paper can be found in the resources section. We are delighted and privileged to have with us this morning the chair of the task force that wrote that white paper, Sally Yurkovich. We'll start by hearing from Sally directly, moving from there to a discussion by the panel, including taking a look at the definition of direct care adopted by the Baltimore Museum of Art, perhaps the most expansive and progressive. A link to it can also be found in the resources section. And we'll see where the conversation takes us from there. Why does the meaning of direct care matter? The pandemic is causing deficits to pile up while staff, remaining staff that is, are largely underpaid. At the same time, museums are being challenged to confront racism and respond to calls for social justice and diversity. All of this takes money. One strategy is to access the proceeds of deaccessioning to fill that gap, yet existing professional standards present a challenge. There are essentially two ways to meet that challenge. One is by modifying the standard to allow for other uses, and there's a lot of discussion going on about that, including in this symposium. The second, important to us today, is to interpret direct care of collection in a more expansive way. Changing the generally accepted meaning of a phrase is much easier than changing a professional standard. The significance of the freedom given each individual museum to define direct care for itself cannot be understated. It clears the way to deploy the proceeds of deaccessioning in a much more expansive and powerful way.
Sorry, everybody. We seem to be having some technical issues, but bear with us for one moment. Another another Zoom situation. Bear with us 1 second. Well, we're waiting to get Mark back online. I wonder if I can ask one of our panelists, Sally, to go ahead and start by discussing the AAM white paper on direct care.
Sure. Good morning, and thank you, Andrew. As Mark mentioned, in 1994, the American Alliance for Museums added the phrase direct care of collections to the Code of Ethics and to the description of the acceptable uses of funds realized from the sale of deaccessioned objects. When that phrase was placed in the Code of Ethics, I think there was a hope that direct care of collections would be defined by practice, and that over the years it would become clear to the museum community what exactly was acceptable use of funds. But in fact, 20 years went by and there hadn't been a clear definition. And the Accreditation Commission of the American Alliance of Museums identified the lack of this definition as one of the critical issues that AAM needed to address. So in 2014, a task force was created to define direct care of collections. The task force was made up of a number of individuals representing different aspects of the museum field. There were art museum directors, history museum directors, as well as historical preservation and historical society directors, directors of a zoo, a children's museum, and botanical gardens and natural history museums. So the task force was composed of people who were broadly representative of the museum field. I see Mark is back again. I don't know whether you want to take over or whether I should continue, Mark.
I have no idea what just happened, but can you tell me how far I got?
You were just about to introduce the other panelists, so we can wait for that till after I.
Sure. Thank you, Sally, and you're doing exactly what I was hoping you would do. I apologize to the audience. I have no idea.
Okay. So, the AAM put together a very diverse group of people to both be spokespersons to the field during the process of defining the direct care, and also to represent the perspective of their specific disciplines. In addition to having a very diverse task force, the process of defining direct care started with a survey of the field. The survey was asked for individual opinions about what direct care was. It wasn't a survey of what your museum feels direct care should be, but it was more directed towards what all individuals in AAM felt direct care should be. So, and it was an anonymous survey. So there was a hope that everyone would feel very free to express their opinions. The survey was revealing. It was revealing in that there was no clear definition of direct care. There were some clear directions in terms of what the field felt was not direct care, as in general operating expenses, and also things that were obviously direct care of collections, like conservation. So there was a whole spectrum of responses that led the task force to realize that there was not going to be a one-size-fits-all definition, that the diversity of opinions reflected the diversity in the museum field at large, and that if we came up with one specific definition or with a list of things that counted as direct care, we would probably just invite more parsing of the issues. For example, if we had said you can't use funds from deaccessioning to repair the roof, we might get questions more about, well, what if the roof's over the collections storage area? Does that make it okay? We didn't want to get caught up in that kind of conversation or have the field go on into the future with those kinds of conversations. So we decided that in order to be most useful, it would be important to develop some broad parameters and to let each museum establish its own definition of direct care, and that would help guide them in the future. We did this also because we thought it was important for each museum to think about this, to think about direct care and how they wish to use proceeds from the sale of deaccessioned objects in a situation where they weren't deaccessioning, but just what what direct care meant to them and how they were going to approach using funds from deaccessioning without being under the heat of the moment of deaccessioning. So instead of a very specific direct definition that enumerated things that were or were not direct care, the task force developed a definition that says that direct care is an investment that enhances the life, usefulness, value, and quality of a museum's collections. It also, the white paper establishes the parameters within which a museum is to think about developing their own direct care definition, making distinctions between strategic investments and quick fixes, band-aids for emergency situations, and also use of funds that have an institution-wide impact as opposed to use of funds that have an impact directly on the care of collections. So the guidelines and recommendations are therefore available to the field, and as well as the sort of broad definition. It has proven, I think, to be helpful, although certainly not, I don't think we've resolved all of the questions as this symposium bears witness to, but it was a really important opportunity for the field to join together and come up with a definition that could help guide museums into the future. Mark?
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Sally. I appreciate that introduction. And again, I apologize. So at this point, let me try again to introduce the rest of the panelists, and hopefully the three of them will join us now. And that is Aamd Pasternak, Director of the Brooklyn Museum, Cara Starke, Executive Director of the Pulitzer Arts Foundation in St. Louis, and Roxana Velásquez, Executive Director of the San Diego Museum of Art. It's a very distinguished panel, and we thank all of them for sharing their thoughts and time with us today. So we've heard from Sally, and I guess I'd like to ask Anne, at this point, if you could share your thoughts on why the concept of direct care is so important to the field.
Thank you, Mark, and good morning, everybody. So first, I want to say it's wonderful to be here. It's important that we're having these conversations. As we all know, deaccessions and direct care are once again a hot topic. COVID has forced many of our nation's art museums to re-examine their missions, their values, and their financial foundations with renewed urgency. As one of many measures, this past fall, the Brooklyn Museum began deaccessioning artworks to create a permanently restricted direct care fund to safeguard one of the most important functions of collecting museums, the care of its collections. Deaccessioning is not new. As you know, museums have been deaccessioning since their founding, and it's not new for the Brooklyn Museum either. With that said, mostly we give to educational institutions, and we're very involved in repatriations. Less frequently, we have deaccessioned works to raise greatly needed acquisition funds. And while modest, over the past dozen years, these funds have allowed us to acquire art by Black, Indigenous, people of color, women, LGBTQIA+, and people with disabilities, while filling in some strategic holes in our historic collections, such as a really great V.G. Lebrun portrait that we bought about 2 years ago. Over recent decades, the cost of collection care has grown exponentially. In fact, the cost of running museums has grown exponentially. There's cost of living increases, important investments for diversity and equity, digital expansion, and a whole lot more. So our budgets have expanded dramatically, and it's made clear that our historic financial models are inadequate at best. While direct care funds can't and shouldn't solve all of these challenges, they can protect the care of our collections in perpetuity. The Brooklyn Museum has over 160,000 objects in its collection. The works we recently deaccessioned constitute less than 0.01% of our collection. And while many of the works recently deaccessioned were of good quality, they were not our best, and many had not been exhibited for decades. In fact, many had never been exhibited. So it's time to rethink museum orthodoxies because we are, and we ought to be, more than static repositories for art. Let us not forget that museums like the Brooklyn Museum amassed vast holdings before we even had strategies for accepting gifts. It's unrealistic to accumulate endlessly. Besides, deaccessions can strengthen a collection through refinements, allowing for experimentation and righting historic collection wrongs. And they can also be used for caring for our collections, and they should be. It is sometimes said deaccessioning is a violation of the public trust. Believe me, I get it. But the ability to carry out our mission is also an issue of public trust. What good are we if we are art rich but cash poor, too poor to do anything with our collections, including properly caring for them, interpreting them, studying them, and even showing them? I agree we should not consider our collections assets for general operating expenses. And deaccessioning for direct care doesn't make sense for all of our institutions, but it does make sense for some of us. Business as usual and doing nothing is simply not an option. It is unfortunate that recently our field has attempted to shut down conversation and prevent possible solutions out of fear. It's important we have these conversations. It's time to get real about the challenges. And so I wish to thank Syracuse University and this conference's organizers for hosting this timely and very important conversation. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Anne. Cara, you are the director of a non-collecting institution, and I'd appreciate knowing why does direct care matter to you in that context?
Thank you, Mark, and thank you as well for inviting me to be here today. So I definitely come here today as a bit of an outlier. I do not represent a collecting museum, and I am not faced with deaccessioning. I run a small museum that presents contemporary and historic art loaned from colleagues around the world. I am therefore in dialogue with and dependent on other museums, on what they collect, on how they collect, on how they care for their collections. Beyond this, however, our wider field is shaped by museological traditions that have historically emerged from a focus on collections. To a great degree, collections and the process of collecting defines museums in both professional and popular understanding. The field's approach to collecting sets the terms for how we all operate, collecting or non-collecting, and decisions about deaccessioning and direct care influence ways of working across the field. And those ways of working, our shared norms and organizational cultures, express a collective set of values. So this is part of why I'm invested in this conversation. I do want to be mindful, though, of my outside perspective. As I've witnessed, deaccessioning and direct care are sensitive issues that people are deeply invested in. And while I've worked in collecting institutions, I'm still continually learning. As someone on the periphery of this conversation, it would be easy for me to make a poorly informed statement that could frustrate my colleagues. However, if there's something gained from having me at the table, it is because of this outside perspective, because of the ways my institution's priorities and our different relationship to collections can enrich or complicate the conversation. To that end, I'm here today because I appreciate the focus on what it means to care, or more specifically, to directly care. While my museum does not center collections nor their long-term care, our mission instead focuses on the other things museums do, the other things that define the field: display, interpretation, education, public engagement. Where do these activities exist on a continuum of care? In other words, where does direct care begin and end? Who and what gets included when we define the terms direct and care, and who and what get left out? I came here with many questions. Does direct care end at the physical care of an object? What about its intellectual care? How are the decisions about the care of an object distinct or not from the people who get to make those decisions? Where are the lines between caring for a collection and caring for a community that will experience, contextualize, or interpret that collection? I do want to add another note, however. In my time at the Pulitzer, we've been asking ourselves if to curate is is to care. What does it mean to care not just for art, but for community and for each other? 2020 challenged all of our organizations. It demanded a profound recognition of the systems of inequity that undergird our society and the position of arts institutions within those systems. We have been forced to confront the widespread consequences and to see how systems make all the difference between those who are protected and those who are vulnerable. As institutions, our protocols, our rules, our norms, and our terms participate in shaping those systems. I am not yet prepared to say how we should define direct care, where we should set its limits. I do believe, however, that when we as a field work to establish or revise our rules, we should take care to consider whether our rules protect the status quo or whether our rules direct us toward a future we hope to see. I recognize that we need rules and norms that prevent abuse, but we also need to make sure that they don't obstruct the possibility of change, of equitable change, of changing how we make meaning or how we engage our world. That's a lot to balance. I feel incredibly privileged to be here today to address these ideas of direct care from perhaps a different but deeply invested perspective. And with that, I thank you all for allowing me to ask more questions than I can probably answer.
Well, Cara, thank you. You've asked a lot of the right questions, and we'll hear from Roxana next, and then we'll try to dig into some of those questions that you've answered. Roxana, would you like to share your thoughts on the issue at the outset, and then we'll get started. Roxana, you're muted.
Is this clear? Can you hear me now? Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you all. I'm very, very early here in California, right? So the sun is not yet there, but I am absolutely delighted to be with you. I think we all are excited to be part of these conversations, these dialogues that will end up of course, in a new world. I hear my colleagues saying things cannot remain in the status quo. We know things have to be revisited. And of course, after the pandemic times, it is an absolute need to see how have we been operating, what can we do better. There is two clear realities. Directors have been fundraising, trying to balance budgets, trying to solve the daily life. And probably there's a burnout, just the same as the Zoom burnout that we all have now after 12 months. But on the other hand, we have to be absolutely careful not to be reactive, not to jump immediately to the solutions and the easy routes. How easy would it be for any of us to sell one of the major pieces and then solve our daily problems? It's also important to take into account that you cannot talk of the museums in the same manner. It is important to know where are we located, how active is the city, the county, the state, providing with funds to any institutions. It's not the same to be in the San Diego Museum of Art than to be at Brooklyn or at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. How much support are we getting? So I see that one topic, very important topic for this precise panel, definition. How do we define a word or a concept, direct care? It's limitless. Direct care could be research. Of course, curators could be included from my perspective in direct care, not only because they will research, but communicate as well the relevance of those objects, conservation, marketing, the physical spaces. It is just endless if we go that route. So I am excited to see these debates, to think thoroughly, what should we do, and also to recommend that we are careful in the next steps and in the way we write our bylaws. It's not one for all. And I would say that at the San Diego Museum of Art, we have been actively deaccessing pieces for the last 7 years with a purpose in mind to improve the collection. It's deaccessing just to exchange for other pieces, and we have added more than 3,000 works of art in the last 5 years. So open for discussions. We have to be careful to not be overshadowed by the immediacy, the immediate needs that Sally just mentioned, and to be a little more careful in how are we looking at our future. But yes, Anne, I agree with you. Things have to change. There's a crying need to think differently, but I would recommend cautious.
Okay. Thank you, Roxana. And that was a nice segue, but the one size doesn't fit all. And I guess starting with the white paper and indeed carried through to FASB and AAM and even AAMD is the underlying principle that these things need to be decided on a museum by museum basis. What does direct care mean to each museum? Presumably decided by the Board of Trustees with professional input, or leadership, or input from professional leadership. Does that make sense to you? You think that is more valuable to have it done on an institution by institution basis, or should the associations be more active in setting tighter guidelines, establishing guardrails?
I would say, Mark, that it would be ideal if AMD could come up with tighter guardrails. But fear around this conversation meant people voted not to even have the conversation, because I think that we have to protect the most vulnerable institutions among us. And as we've all said, there isn't a one-size-fits-all institution. My situation is very different than my Manhattan colleagues, which is very different from, a museum where the collection may be owned by the city or the state in which they exist, or a university museum or gallery. So there's all these kinds of nuances. And I think to protect the most vulnerable, it would be helpful for the AMD to have some guidelines about what we would define as direct care. Without that, we'll just rely on what our boards have voted on.
And you think that's problematic to rely on?
I think it's not ideal.
Any other thoughts on that? And Sally, you provided the white paper provided tools for individual boards to look at these things.
Excellent.
Instead of doing, pardon me?
I was saying they were excellent tools, and
they were.
They guided the work that we did at the Brooklyn Museum. And I think it's really admirable, the process. I just want to say this and then I'll be quiet. The process that AAM had in surveying the field to get everybody's diverse input, and a multi-year process to carefully consider these issues. And I think I want to applaud AAM and everybody who participated in that task force for doing such a great job that really helped the field. And that took to get there, right, Sally?
Right.
Yes, but also, Sally, echoing what Anne says, it gave us a lot of security, because believe me, this is not the first time somebody comes and says, why don't you sell that George O'Keeffe? Why don't you get rid of that Monet? I mean, boards also not necessarily connected to our soul or the mission of museums, always went there. As I said, the easy route for financial thinking, and your paper, your white paper, helped us for many, many years. So thank you also.
It's good to know that the work that we all did is proving to be really useful. It's always hard when you're in the process of creating something to know what's going to happen afterwards. So thank you on behalf of AAM.
Well, and I mean, that's a question I've been thinking about, Sally, and that's, you must be, I don't want to try to articulate your emotion, but the work you did and the concept of direct care seems to have exploded in significance beyond what you had done. I mean, it is now the core of, is something right or wrong? Is it direct care or not? And it just seems like what the work you did has taken on such great significance as this issue has evolved. And we'll talk about things like what Baltimore Museum, how they define it in a minute. But my guess is that that's exceeded what your prediction would have been for how this paper has been used. I mean, are you surprised by what's going on?
I'm surprised at the amount of time that it's taken for the conversation to really start. I guess. I had expected a much more immediate reaction. I mean, the white paper was originally published in 2016, so it's been a few years. So I'm surprised. I'm surprised at that more than anything else. But I'm also pleased to see, and here I'm just speaking for myself, not for anyone else, either on the task force or at AAM. I'm pleased to see so many museums really coming forward and creating their own definitions that clearly suit their needs, or not their needs, but their situation, their mission, and all of that, because that's what we had originally envisioned. And I think it's very gratifying to see that that's worked.
So does anyone else have a comment on whether specificity would be better, or is the freedom given by boards a more appropriate strategy?
I'll chime in. I also applaud AAM's document. I found it incredibly fascinating, and I also think it is important the way it leads organizations to develop these concepts for their own. But I also do agree with Aamd that it is important to provide those guideposts. And I think there's a tremendous amount of fear in terms of the parameters that could be set up that aren't inclusive and thinking about all the different types and needs of organizations out there. And so to some degree, that was what I was trying to lay out in the beginning, that there's a tremendous host of issues and complicated negotiations between, but that guideposts do help. When done well, do help vulnerable institutions, do provide a way forward, do allow for change as well, and a recognition that perhaps the systems of the past are not going to be the systems of the future. That said, it's a tremendous undertaking to produce any such standards. So,
yeah, so that's a really interesting question. I wasn't expecting that answer, but if the professional associations are going to get into the business of establishing guardrails, I wonder if anyone has an appetite for that, and how do you achieve some kind of consensus on where the guardrails should be? Should direct care include interpretation? Should it, is it storage or is it not storage? Is it clearly conserving objects would be, are interpreting objects direct care?
Mark, we already have guide rails, right? AMD, for example, gives us guidance on how to deaccession. Work that's redundant in the collection, work that's not of museum quality or can't be conserved. There's a whole laundry list of things that they help to guide us through when it comes to deaccessioning works already. And we use those guidelines, and every single one of our institutions runs by guidelines. So guidelines is not something that we're unfamiliar with. It would just take a similar process, I believe, to what AAM did, of really listening for quite some time to the field, understanding what the issues are and seeing if we could come out with some guideposts that really, again, as both Cara and I have said, protect the most vulnerable of our institutions. For example, we don't want a repeat of what happened in Detroit. We don't want to see university museums or galleries, their collections ravaged by presidents of universities that don't care about the art but care about other things like research. These are very real issues, and I believe they can be solved, but we have to have the conversation. And what just happened at AMD is our colleagues said we don't even want to have the conversation. I find that highly, highly problematic.
But I just want to be sure we're not blurring guardrails around deaccessioning and guardrails around what is direct care. I mean, clearly the task force at AAM did not want to get into saying repairing the roof is, replacing a restroom used by a registrar is not. And what I'm trying to get a grasp of here is the guardrail isn't around I mean, there are guardrails around what can be is a proper deaccessioning. This is, are the associations going to try to define, should they be defining what direct care means? Not whether deaccessioning is good or bad, but what direct care means. And AAM made the intentional decision in the task force to say, no, we're going to give some guidance on how you should figure it out, but we're not going to tell you what the answer is. And I'm just wondering if, so the next question would have been, what's the role of the associations in enforcing those, of dealing with museums that really push the definition of direct care? Should there be the same sort of enforcement, sanctioning, shaming that goes on for museums that deaccession improperly? Do the associations, should they be getting into the business of, well, you've deaccessioned property, but you've used it in a manner that exceeds what we believe direct care should be? Is there a role for associations in that? Okay.
I mean, Aamd sanctions when people inappropriately deaccession, right? I don't know how meaningful that is or isn't. I think I'm just more interested that we get to a point at some point of just conversation about what direct care would mean and some guidelines around what direct care could be. Whether, Aamd should be sanctioning institutions that violate that, I can't speak to that personally. We just don't know.
And also, Mark, of course, I've been part of Aamd for many, many years, and I think Aamd has evolved in many ways as well. I mean, they cannot just turn the face. The change is here. The future is already here. Things have been desacralized, right? So they also are organic in that sense. So it is not the Aamd that you are remembering and you always quote about 20 years ago, right? The problem that was faced. So yes, I believe it is a larger group of people, different museums, different generations, different backgrounds, and many people like me that have worked in Mexico or in Europe or in the States who bring to the table different conversations. It's important also to look what happens in those national museums, not only look into ourselves, because those examples for centuries also should help us advance this conversation. But yes, they will have a role, but I think it's much more loose or more organic, if you will, than it was 20 years ago.
Okay, so we've talked about the environment for for looking at this, the freedom given museums, the environment in which the professional associations operate. So let's get a little closer to the ground here and try to get some sense of what you as professionals actually think of as direct care or not. So, and I think the best way to, well, that's the way we're going to do it. I don't know if it's the best way would be to look at Baltimore's direct care thing, and I'll go through it in a minute here, and get your thoughts on how, whether that's too broad, appropriate, without passing judgment on your colleagues and peer institutions, but just your thoughts on some of the concepts. So just for the audience background, not quite 6 months after AAMD's statement, Baltimore Museum of Art announced its plan to sell 3 paintings expected to generate $65 million in proceeds. Of that amount, $55 million was to be devoted to an endowment for direct care of the collection, which under the broad definition crafted by Baltimore would include salaries of curators, registrars, conservators, art handlers, and others. By applying the endowment's expected annual revenue of $2.5 million to direct care, a like amount would be freed to be used for operating expenses. In the case of Baltimore, that revenue would fund equity and accessibility initiatives, including a reassessment of salary levels for all staff, with increases ranging from 3% to 48% over 3 years. Executive Director Chris Bedford, our keynote speaker this afternoon, said that the initiative was done, quote, specifically in recognition of the protest being led by museum staff to be paid an equitable living wage to perform core work for an institution with a social justice mission. So I'm asking that we take a look at the definition of direct care adopted by Baltimore Museum of Art. There is a link in the resources section to that policy, but it provides the Baltimore Museum of Art considers direct care of its collection to be any investment or expenditure supporting the research, presentation, documentation, interpretation, and preservation of the BMA's permanent collection in order to ensure its longevity and its broad accessibility to direct audiences. And for me, one of the most compelling phrases there is accessibility. Baltimore has included accessibility among direct care. So my request to you is what do you think of that? Is that an appropriate, again, we're not passing judgment, but it should, not Baltimore right or wrong, but is a broad definition like that appropriate? Does it scare you? Does it warm your heart? How do you feel about it? Anne.
You guys don't make me go first all the time. Okay, I will. Oh, Cara, I saw you were about to. Do you want to go first, Cara?
Sure. What that statement, one of the things that I do appreciate about that statement is that it recognizes the whole host of things that come behind notions of direct care, that there are people who make those decisions, and that their training, their thinking, their decision-making around the curatorial process, around all of the work that we do, affects the final decisions. I'm sorry, I'm gonna let Anne go. I've got a noisy toddler behind me.
I wish they were in with us, Cara. I miss them. So, I agree with Cara, and I think that in Cara's very beautiful opening statement, actually, she's defining what is the very purpose of our museums and asking us to consider an expansive view of the purpose of our museums. And I think that's what the Baltimore Museum has implied with its very expansive direct care policy. It certainly has created a lot of conversation, disagreement and controversy. And I just wish we could get past the controversy and have those fundamental conversations about what it means to be a museum, what it means to be a collecting institution, and how our collections are employed for our missions. I know that I'm going to get killed for using the term employed, but at any rate, so I don't really have a comment on their policy. It was certainly very expansive. They put their values out there and they stuck by them. We at the Brooklyn Museum have a much more specific understanding of direct care. We were considerably more conservative, which is not a value. I don't know that their strategy wasn't a better strategy, but we thought that since direct care has not been so clearly defined, that we were defining direct care as the direct care of an object. So the percentage of time a conservator is, I need a coffee this morning. The percentage of time a conservator is spending on actually caring for an object. The amount of percentage of time that a collections care manager is transporting an object into conservation, those kinds of things. We were much more conservative, but I think that what Baltimore has done is so worthy of our conversation.
I think too that it also demonstrates how just hearing Anne talk versus hearing the Baltimore statement demonstrates how each museum needs to have their own statement that makes sense with their mission and their goals. And I think it's creating a statement about direct care isn't a one-time thing. It's something that could be just like our missions are, reviewed and rethought periodically. A statement about direct care of collections could be the same. And if we're changing our direction, then our definitions could change.
So the definition that you read us of direct care really entails what we all do: accessibility, of course, conservation, preservation. It's the mission of the museums, just associated now to a definition of direct care. But when I'm reading you, when I'm hearing you, I hear exactly what art museums intend to do. So I just wanted to say that. And the same at the San Diego Museum of Art, direct care is directly connected to the tactical needs of a piece, of an object. And then comes the mission and the purpose, and in a higher level of the ethos of the institution. But I hear a broad statement, and I don't think it's debatable. It's just all inclusive in a mission, Mark, that goes beyond a definition of direct care. And I would like to ask if that was created before or after the fact, because it is a really broad one, as you say, but it's good for them.
Cara, do you want to finish your thought?
No, I actually really appreciated what Roxana and Sally and Ann said.
Okay, so I think we would all agree that Baltimore's is expansive. And so I guess the question is that, and maybe you've sort of answered it, is it okay? Is it something that professional associations should have the role and the authority to come in and say, you know, we looked at Brooklyn's and, you know, that was okay. We looked at Baltimore's and we felt that was a little too far out there. Should the field be policing those things for itself, or should, as Roxana has alluded to, should it be, and Sally too, I guess all of you have, more of an individual decision, which really was the white paper's premise to begin with, and is encompassed in FASB and in so many other pronouncements, is that this is local. It's not global.
Well,
Whereas, to your point, Ann, deaccessioning is, you know, there are standards around that. Should there, you know, should this be a deferral to the boards, to the local boards?
You know, I wonder if Aamd just membership just gave institutions like Baltimore a free pass by shutting down the conversation. And it makes me worry for institutions, as I said earlier, like universities that are more vulnerable. And so I do think, you know, again, that having some standards from Aamd would help protect the field, protect our institutions. So I still think it's a good idea, but it may not happen. As we know, the membership voted against even having the conversation.
Yeah, just to elaborate on that a bit, I mean, we're only 1 year into the 2-year moratorium. There's still, what, 12, 13 months to go to have that conversation. I mean, there were a lot of observers who were sort of surprised that the revisiting took place within 11 months instead of at the 22nd month. So again, I wasn't in the room. I don't think I'll ever be in that room. But I mean, would you agree that there is still time for Aamd either to extend the moratorium, to make it permanent, to change it in some way? I mean, or has the door been shut on that?
I would advise that the membership just engage in the conversation.
Mm-hmm.
That's all I think is that we need to do for now.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if the door is shut. I hope it's not, but it might be.
So my understanding, Mark and Ann, is that it will happen, that they will get back to talk of this. I mean, you cannot just choose not to talk about something that is in front of you. You know, there's no option here, but I think it's going to get over. And why start beforehand? Because of course, all the crisis that it has caused, all the movement, all the fracture, obviously it's a time that we need to be talking. There's no shutdown. This is not the time for that.
Okay, let's see. So, Ann, you raised the issue of subsidiary museums that are held by parent organizations like academic museums, and that happens to be one of the questions that just was presented from the audience as well. Let me just read this as it's written. If we open the door to using funds from deaccessions for a broadened definition of direct care that includes operations costs like salaries and facilities, what will happen to academic museums whose parent organization will inevitably view their collection as fungible assets? What is the plan to protect them? And what would a landscape with very few surviving academic museums mean to both the field and the public? I don't think academic museums are going away, but it's an interesting question. And there's a full session this afternoon on the differences between museums that have parent organizations and those that don't. But it's a different fiduciary standard. Do you have any comment on your thoughts on academic museums, the role that direct care plays in the context of having a parent organization?
Well, I think I've shared my concern for their vulnerability.
Mm-hmm.
and that they would really benefit from having some guidelines around direct care.
And it raises also the interesting issue of who defines it for a museum that really has no legal board that governs its operations. I mean, academic museums frequently have advisory boards, but it is the board of trustees of the college or university that actually implements the policies for that institution, and the museum is one resource.
By the way, can I just stand up for boards for a second? Because it's really made me crazy during this time period, how people are just like, oh, all these museums have billionaires on their board and they should just be paying for everything. And I find that so perplexing at best. First of all, very few institutions have bunches of billionaires on their boards. I happen to be blessed with a very generous board of directors whose giving keeps increasing and increasing. But we can't expect a public institution that was founded over 200 years ago to be solely funded by a handful of privileged people. And I just find it so bizarre that that's even a conversation out there. And I think it's really time to get real about boards. And by the way, they're also under such scrutiny these days that you have to be courageous to be on a museum board these days. So I just think we need to have a real conversation about what it means to run these institutions and the roles of boards in many of our cases who are already being extraordinarily responsible and generous, and not just look to a handful of people to solve all of our problems. It's just strange.
And also, Mark, the executive directors or the directors should build the boards. I mean, this conversation of the director or the staff against the board, it sounds also so oldie to me. It's kind of ancient because, of course, if you have been in an institution 5-10 years, you already have rebuilt your board and create this relation that has to be a dance and not a fight, right? So that also for me sounds like strange, to say the less.
Yeah, I think the issue you're raising is it could be accession in and of itself, sort of unrelated or related, but not directly related to deaccessioning. But I think, Anne, your point is a very good one, because frequently there are a lot of commentators will say, oh, that's a great idea to bring diversity to the collection, or that's a great idea to do this or that, to pay people more, but don't sell anything to do it. Have the boards, that's the board's responsibility to pay. Now, I don't represent museums like the Met. I represent museums that are regional, that have boards that are teachers and business owners and restaurant operator or whatever, good-hearted people who don't write really large checks. And I think it's, it's a little bit offensive to say it is the board's responsibility to backfill deficits. And I think, Roxana, your point is well taken too, that people like to assume there's a controversy between boards and professional leadership. And the ones I've seen are by and large partnerships. There's an alignment. I don't think any of you could do what you do without board support. I don't think Baltimore could do what it did if its boards were not in alignment, if a board was not in alignment.
That's exactly right. And of course, there are institutions that have irresponsible leadership on staff as well as on boards, which is again why you need guidelines to help protect institutions from poor leadership.
And that, sort of related to that is a question we had before about why not give those boards, guided by their professional leadership, the discretion to determine what is direct care for themselves. Bringing that back to the topic is, is that different in Syracuse, New York than it is in Brooklyn? Or is it different in Brooklyn than it is in Manhattan or New Jersey? And how do we, who knows best, I guess is the question.
I don't think the creation of guidelines means that there's not also the possibility of institutions and museums making decisions that are right for their context or their conditions. But I think it requires a really nuanced conversation, a deep understanding of a lot of the fear that I hear around these conversations to better be able to address those questions and concerns and simultaneously be able to address the whole host of missions and communities and organizations that these museums serve. We are certainly not a singular type. So I think it's a yes and situation, that there's the opportunity for guidelines, but there's also the opportunity around having those be directly connected to decision-making on behalf of each museum and organization.
All right, there's a question here for Anne. Brooklyn Museum of Art has created an endowment for direct care from deaccession proceeds during the period of relaxed AAMD standards. When the AAMD resolution expires, will Brooklyn's intended use of earnings from that endowment be in violation of AAMD guidelines? If so, what will Brooklyn do with those earnings?
It's such a good question. So what we've created is not an endowment. We've created a permanently restricted fund. It's just legally, technically, there's a difference there. But it functions like an endowment, and that the idea is that it gets invested. And our view as an institution was, if you're not going to have the artwork in perpetuity, you at least have the funds in perpetuity. And AMD had said to use the funds. They didn't define use. To us, the most responsible use of funds was to create a permanently restricted restricted fund. And so we do not see that we're in violation of AMD, and we are going to stick to our guns without question, that this was the most responsible thing for us to do.
Mm-hmm. Does anyone else want to comment on that? I'm sorry, I'm just scrolling through a couple of questions to see if we here's one. If the professional associations don't define direct care, then how do we avoid the scorched earth criticism from outside critics, commentators, and bloggers that is so vitriolic and damaging to individual museums?
Not to mention their directors. I think that, it's conversations like these, Mark, where we try to at least touch upon some of the complexities of running institutions so that people have greater understanding. But at the end of the day, people just want to scorch institutions and their leadership. So, haters are going to hate.
So I haven't asked you to ask yourselves questions. Are there any things that you think the audience ought to hear on this topic before we go back to looking at some other questions? Is there anything that you'd like to say or you'd like to have discussed?
I guess one of the things I'd just like to put out there is that I'm a big believer in less storage and more galleries. So, I go back to Cara's sort of opening questions about who are we as institutions, and how we align our resources tells us a lot about what we value. And, I do think that this is a really healthy moment for deep, real conversation on what it means to be an art museum. Collections central to that, but not the only thing that we consider. And it's a period of really assessing how we're aligned with our values. And I think ultimately that's what this is about. That's what Baltimore really pushed open as a conversation. We may not agree with what they were proposing to deaccession or have strong feelings about it, but at the end of the day, they were being clear about their values, whether we agree with them or not. And some of those values I absolutely agree with.
This also pushes a little bit beyond the question of direct care, but in looking at and processing a lot of the criticism around these sets of issues, I frequently see comment of public trust, which Anne alluded to as well in her opening comments. And I want to admit that I actually truthfully struggle with this concept of it, in part because I ask, which publics are we referring to? And are there publics for whom we've already broken their trust? Who's welcome? Who does not see themselves reflected in our organizations? And I raise that because I think there's also the capacity to build trust through these processes as well. So it goes a little bit beyond just the question of direct care. I've frequently seen this in reference to deaccessioning. But I think the figure of the public is very important as we approach all of these conversations.
So I think that's an important point. Oh, Roxana, go ahead.
Really just sharing last thoughts that yes, it is a lot of scrutiny, criticism, blogs, and it is very simple and easy to do that. But what I would invite our audiences is to really take a close look of what has happened with our museums and how we are really truthful to the mission of sharing art. What have we done and what is a day like in a day for us? I mean, it is so complex, and I would love to hear propositions, right, rather than criticisms, because it seems to me that this polarized situation does not help us advance. I've been reading the larger museums versus the smaller museums, but if people would also help us think about this. The pandemic, yes, brought us to the weakest probably positions, showcasing the needs that many have, but it also brought us a lot of accessibility. And I have to talk about the positive things here and how was the outreach for us, at least enlarged broadly, you know, in Europe and across the United States. So there are good things as well during these times. So again, lots of movements, lots of scrutiny, but we need to fundraise, but then we have to be careful who do we invite. And so it's kind of a difficult time. So I'm asking, yes, for great ideas, but also for empathy, a word we all use here and there. We have to be empathetic because we are sharing this moment in time. We are not the museums of the time of Versailles. We are today's museum. So how could we all help and do positive comments as well? Just that.
Definitely agree there. There's so much listening to be had around these conversations rather than starting from antagonism, but just trying to deeply understand the concerns of all the variety of museums that are touched by these issues.
Yeah. So in that light, you know, I've been at so many of these conferences, so many symposiums, you know, so many panels that discuss these issues. And we discuss them among our, well, I shouldn't be including myself in the field, but museum professionals discuss them among themselves. And, you know, there's some board members who do represent their communities, and that's what board members are supposed to do. There don't seem to be a lot of them, you know, in discussions like this as representatives of their community. And I wonder, is the field having these deaccessioning discussions, the collections, the priority of collections, the use of proceeds, the definition of direct care? Is it too insulated a conversation, do you think, from what your constituents might want or expect museums to do?
Probably. You know, I have a weekly update that goes to my trustees, and we always have reading materials as we do for our staff. And so, you know, later I'm going to email Cara and say, Cara, can you please send me your opening remarks note so that I can share that with my trustees? And, you know, they've all been invited to this conference, for example. So I think that it's our responsibility as leaders to support the conversation, the learning, and the debate within our own organizations. But I do think it would benefit our field if all of our institutions were coming together with trustees for learning opportunities like this.
Yeah, and that goes back a little bit, Anne, to your comment before about the division, or maybe it was Roxana, division between trustees and professional leadership. And, you know, I've often heard, well, trustees can't be trusted with collections, you know. I
mean, listen, there are institutions where that is a concern. And there are institutions where you may have trustees or donors say, well, why don't you just sell an object as opposed to me giving you money? Those are reasonable concerns. And again, I say that's why we need Aamd to come up with some guidelines for us so that we, you know, can prevent the very real problems and also not slow our progress and support as institutions. I'm concerned about the very welfare of a lot of our nation's museums and their ability to serve out their missions, let alone survival. And direct care could be a part of the solution, not the whole solution, but a meaningful part of the solution. You know, all of our institutions are funded by, you know, numerous strategies. There's admissions, there's trustees, there's membership, there's the shop, there's, you know, so many things that we do, earned income galore. We're all expanding, or most of us are expanding in multiple directions. And I believe that direct care should be considered one of those options.
So coming back to Sally for a minute, I mean, you've heard the conversation about how it might be useful to have more guidance. You're willing to take that on again? No, but I'd be curious to know, do you think that's a valuable, would that be a valuable exercise for the field to go through? And you having done it once already?
I think the important thing is to have the conversations that we're having. It's difficult. We had difficulty. I think we provided the guidance that we felt at the time would help the field. And we wanted museums to begin to have these kinds of conversations, not necessarily just among themselves, but and their trustees, but also with their supporters and their members, so that there would generally be more transparency about these issues, so that the public would understand better what the challenges museums face, and so that also they would appreciate the responsibilities that museums have, both to their very diverse audiences and communities and to their collections. So I think that part of the challenge is really opening up that conversation and promoting further understanding of some of these issues.
Anyone, I think it's extremely well put, Sally. I think there's certainly good reason to do that. I wonder how a museum engages effectively with all of its constituents. You know, is that a relinquishment of what the board is supposed to do in their representative capacity? Is it, what form of outreach do you go to your community? How do you go to your community and say, what would you prefer? Would you prefer a focus on collections, or would you prefer a focus on social justice and programming? You know, how important is it that we, you know, have direct, you know, if we use direct care broadly to support other accessibility initiatives? Is that okay with you?
I don't think it's so much asking people what they think you should be doing, but it's explaining to them why you're doing what you're doing. I have a favorite example that is so removed from a lot of our museums that I like to use it, actually. This was many years ago. The Detroit Zoo was faced with a dilemma. They had 2 aging elephants and that needed to retire. They were not doing well in the cold Detroit climate. But these elephants happen to also be very, very popular with the community. So of course, as soon as they began to talk about retiring their elephants, this got to the press and there was a storm brewing. So they went to the community. They reached out, they had several community meetings, and they talked to people about why they were doing what they were doing. And in the end, the community supported them in their decision, and in fact helped you know, put off some of the controversy that arose, because this isn't an easy decision to make. I didn't know that, but it isn't. So I think that that's more the issue. It's really opening up a bit and not being so, you know, not being insular, but opening up and explaining why you're doing what you're doing. Get the support for your elephants, in other words, for retiring your elephants.
It was out before social media.
Yes, it was.
Yeah, I think social media makes a big difference in community engagement.
Yeah.
You have any thoughts on how I mean, we haven't, I mean, that was sort of an out of the blue sort of topic that we haven't talked about before, but you know what, in a sense of getting community engagement and all of that, how do you, and support for things like direct care and the definition of direct care, does that, how do you engage your community in those types of decisions?
All I can say about that is that I'm happy I'm not a museum director right now. It's social media has made things so much more complex. And you have to respond, but how you respond is really the challenge.
Of course, it has complicated issues, but it has also brought us closer to the community, right? It's the two sides of the coin. And now we have staffs only devoted to answer, right? The one complaint or the two complaints. And I find myself obviously every day listening to, oh, one person was not happy. I said, oh, I'm so sorry, you know, but you hear, and definitely I feel much closer to the community. But to your question, how do we approach communities? That's every day, every single day, 24 hours, 7 days a week. So we are always receiving advices or suggestions for exhibitions or for acquisitions. I mean, it's great how the avenue for communication has opened. Sometimes a little too much, but that also has created this sense of pride and ownership. I'm talking specifically about my museum in this city, right? But you can see and feel that. So for good or for bad, yes, social media is out there and we are much closer. We are all buddies now.
Thank you for that. And Andrew has appeared, and I think our time is up. And I want to thank all of the panelists. This has been a delightful conversation. I hope the audience has enjoyed it. And thank you all for being here and sharing this time with us. Andrew.
Thank you very much, Mark. Thank you, Syracuse.
Thank you. Thank you to all. Bye-bye.
Thank you to all the panelists, and thank you, Mark. Just a very quick reminder, we're going to have our brief break before our next session, and we look forward to seeing everybody soon.